Maybe you've done something over the years and now you're better at it. Maybe you had a bad habit. And now that bad habit is one that you've conquered. Maybe it was a problem with drinking too much, or maybe it was a problem with eating too much, or maybe it was a problem with being irritable and being mean-spirited. But now you're not that way. You've changed. You've gotten better. Well, in what sense can we say then that it's still you? Well, really, are you a different person now than you were before? Now, we say that conversationally. I'm different. I'm a different man than I used to be. But I don't literally mean that I've changed identities, that I'm somehow occupying a different form of being in the world. I'm saying that I've improved, I've changed. Well, that therefore means, if that's true, that I can be the same person but better, that must mean that I must be occupying or existing within some kind of entity or unity that is capable both of change and of maintaining itself the same in some fundamental way. And the point is we can't do that materially. If we're just talking about the brain, if we're just talking about chemicals, if we're just talking about electricity in our neurons, we can't speak that way. Because again, that itself doesn't provide either the unity or the explanation for how somebody can grow. I know this sounds abstract, but here's a really concrete example of it. Because people can say, well, you know what it is? It's just the brain. The brain is a marvelous organ. And it is a marvelous organ. And it's capable of things that we still don't and maybe we'll never completely understand. And one materialist answer could be, well, the brain holds itself in time and space and is constantly generating the self, projecting the self into the future, and pulling itself from the past into the present to create a person. And that's just a fixture of the brain. It's just a brain capacity that we have. And evidence of that, they'll say, is we'll think about when somebody, for example, starts suffering from Alzheimer's or senility, or they have a brain injury. Well, you see there, the personality's gone, right? And so that's evidence, they say, for their position, that it's not that there's this thing called the soul, which is what I've been trying to move us towards this whole time. It's a serious argument. It's not easy. If you've ever known somebody, for example, who's had a head injury and their personality is different than they used to be, then you might think, well, maybe I can't use that argument. Maybe that I have to set that one aside. But then there's this thing called terminal lucidity. I wrote it down here, terminal lucidity. It's a very well documented phenomenon, and it might have even happened to you in the sense of somebody that you know intimately. And this is basically what happens. Many, many, many people near death, for various different reasons, who otherwise have been declared, in a sense, brain dead or comatose, meaning that if you do a scan of do an MRI of their brain, you're not going to see any activity except for that activity which is responsible for the most basic functions of respiration and digestion and things like that. So they're brain dead, as it were. In many instances, well documented, scientifically, in the hours or moments before death, people who have otherwise been incapable of opening their eyes, in some cases for very long periods of time, will suddenly come back. And they'll be exactly the person that they were before the disease or the accident or something or whatever exactly happened to them. And usually they'll be not only sort of somewhat present, but they'll be lucid. That's where that word lucidity comes from. They'll be totally clear. Before they didn't recognize you, before they didn't even recognize themselves. Now they know who they are, they know who you are, they know who everyone else is, and what they're typically doing in these instances is they're saying goodbye and oftentimes talking to people who otherwise people can't be seen by the others in the room. Happens with great frequency, this. Now, if we are just matter, right, if we're just made up of stuff, then that is physically impossible. If we're just a brain, then we have no explanation for how that's possible. And some people say, well, it's just the brain is lacking oxygen, and so you start hallucinating. They're not hallucinating. That's the point of calling it lucidity. They're actually present in the moment, seeing everything that's going on as they slip out of biological existence into what we would say eternal existence. So what all this evidence points to is that we have something called a soul. That there is something about being human that involves a unity, an immaterial unity that binds us together as a person, that interacts very, very closely with the body. And in fact, that's what we believe as Catholics, is that the way that you use your body, including using your body to do either good things or bad things, actually sort of seeps into your soul, for better or for worse. So the body and the soul, it's not that we have the soul sort of just floating around inside of us. It's that we are united while we're in this life so intimately that the body affects the soul, and of course the soul affects the body. But it's only because of the soul that we can talk about this kind of upward unity that we have, this vertical unity, and also this horizontal unity through time and through space that allows us both to remain the same person as we change for worse or for better, and then that which we can also point to that breaks through or can break through as we slip from this life to the next. Now here's the thing. If we do have souls, and there's good evidence we have souls, then that means that something real but immaterial exists. So then the question would be, well, where does the soul come from? How is it possible for a soul to exist? Not just my soul, but your soul, all souls. How could they exist? What powers them? What holds them together? Well, then you're back into the territory of talking about the cause, the immaterial cause of a particular immaterial being, and you're back to making arguments about the existence of God. Just by entering into yourself and asking questions about how it's possible for me to be right here, right now, as an I and as a me. So play with this. This is a deep spiritual insight. It may sound, again, it may sound philosophically remote, but the basic idea here is at the very bottom, God is closer to us all the time than we are to ourselves. We don't need to. And again, there's nothing wrong with doing it. There's nothing wrong with going on a great pilgrimage or visiting beautiful cathedrals. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But the point is that it's not necessary, strictly speaking, in order to find God. God is already right here, right now, among us, in us, and in fact constituting us, actively willing our existence in this very, very, very moment. So perhaps one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God is just that I am, and you are, and we are. So those fall under the psychological or the argument from the existence of the self. I want to go to another category, and here we're now in significantly different territory, but remember what unites all of this is that these are arguments for God's existence. So here's some preliminary issues before I get into the question of the different forms of morality and how that helps us understand the existence of God. First, it's important to note that these arguments are not direct arguments for God's existence. What I mean by that is that you don't need to use morality in order to prove, or you can't, strictly speaking, use morality in order to prove that God exists. In order to make it work, you have to say something like this. If it's true that morality exists, then the only way that it's possible for morality to exist would be to say that God also exists. So it's somewhat of an indirect argument to God's existence, but don't let that discourage you. It's still a very, very, very important one. So again, what we're saying here is that if morality really exists, then the only possible explanation for morality's existence is the existence of God. Now, I could say at the outset, I could say, well, look, you can just say morality doesn't exist. You can parry my argument even before I begin it by saying, well, look, you're starting with a premise that I don't affirm. I don't think morality exists. We're going to get into that with a bit more depth in just a moment, but fine. Say that morality doesn't exist. Say it's an illusion. Say it's a social convention. Say it's just a silly superstition. But be consistent. If you say that morality doesn't exist, wipe clean from your vocabulary the word do, do not, should not, ought not, because those words now have zero meaning. Zero meaning whatsoever. In other words, you're committed to being what's called a relativist, saying that there's no such thing as any form of morality. And the problem with that is that being a relativist is both internally incoherent in this sense. If I say relativism is true, meaning that what's true is that there's no such thing as moral truth, I believe that to be true, which means I'm no longer a relativist. So it's incoherent for me to say I'm a relativist. Even more than that is that you're not living that way. I've met plenty of people who call themselves a relativist. I've never met one who has the courage to live up to his or her convictions. Why? One of the examples I like to use with my students because they love to entertain these propositions because they don't have to live according to the consequences of them. So what if I came up to you and, after your midterm, I gave everybody, I decided that for most of the class, I'm going to give them a grade that corresponds with their performance according to this rubric that I gave them on this assignment. But now I'm going to give you a paper that says F, big red letters, F. And you're going to look at it and say, well, what did I do wrong? And I'll say, well, nothing. Your answer actually it's a good answer. Why are you giving me F? I don't like your face. Face annoys me. Don't like how it's put together. Got one eyebrow kind of just like looking like you're kind of questioning me and smirking at me. And the student says, well, that's not fair. Like, you think it's not fair, don't you, right? Well, of course you don't think it's not fair. It's an arbitrary consideration to take someone's appearance into account when you're grading an exam. But you know what that means? Stop calling yourself a relativist. You don't live like that. You would never accept somebody in your life treating you the way that a true relativist would treat you. So let's stop the charade right now. So, philosophically speaking, relativism is a potential possibility, but I've never met one in person. Wise words. A professor once told me this, and it's something that I wish I could somehow implement into the force of law, is that everyone should be required to live according to their own beliefs. There should be some force that makes people actually have to abide by their own things that they say. The things that come out of their mouth, they should actually have to consistently live with. And that would definitely be a test for relativism. It would go away overnight. So 2 questions to address as we move forward in looking at the different moral theories and how they relate to the question of God. In order to talk about morality, we have to identify 2 different things which we can separate but have to then put together in order to have a moral theory. The first question is what gives morality the capacity to command? What gives it authority? What makes it give it the ability to say to you, this is what you should do? Because all of us can ask, and we start doing it as kids, right? Why? On what grounds? And ultimately, of course, it's not going to be enough because I said so. That's not going to be a moral theory. That would be just coercion, right? So we have to have some kind of rational standard by which we can identify something that says this is what gives it authority and this is why you should do it. But here's the second one. It's one thing to say that a principle has authority. It's another thing for me to say, why should I do it? Why should I obey what my reason is telling me to obey? What motivates me to do it? Now, especially when we're talking about human beings here, right? That's a very important question. Because we can think about the cogitations that we do in terms of our intellectual exercises, think about math, right? And when we do even basic arithmetic, right, our mind leads us to a certain kind of conclusion, and that has authority for us. We recognize, oh, that's the answer. That's true. But how many times in our life do we say, oh, that's true, but I'm not going to do it, right? So we need something that actually motivates us to move in the direction that our mind is identifying as true. We need both of them.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
So, 4 options for thinking about morality without God. Option number 1 is the one I briefly just touched on. It's to say there's no such thing as morality. Okay, then we have to take that seriously as an option. We know there's going to be some implications there, but we at least have to recognize it as an option. Option number 2 is to say, well, look, we can deduce morality from reason itself without reference to God. Now, by deduction, I mean that we can recognize that somehow reason has the power to tell us what to do, and we don't need to speak about God at all in order to do that. We just need reason. Reason is enough. So we can start from general principles, deduce the truth of them, and then move down and apply them. That's option number 2. Option number 3 is to say, well, look, morality can be deduced from nature without God. Now, option number 3 and 4 look very similar, but there's some really big differences. What this option is saying, option number 3, is that, look, we can look out into the world, into nature, and what we'll find is that there is something like a natural law. And that natural law that tells us what's good and what's bad, and then we can grab onto that and use that and say that's what gives us our morality, and then apply it to our lives. But we can do all of that without talking about God, that God is not necessary in order to talk about natural law. Option number 4 is also using nature, but it's using what's called the method of induction, not deduction. Now, don't get worried about those words. All that means is that I'm starting from observation. I'm starting from not from looking for some kind of fixed rational principle in existence, like at the metaphysical level, but just observing around me using my senses, and then looking for patterns here and there and here and there and here and there, and then based upon all of these patterns together, then saying, well, look, here's my collection of data, and then this data tells me that this is good, and this data tells me that this is bad. So this would be like the scientific way of trying to prove that morality exists, all was saying, and we don't need God to do it. Okay, so 4 options. Let's test these options. You can probably know what side I'm going to come on down, but let's give a fair hearing to each one of them. All right, so option number 1, there is no morality. Again, I already touched on this, but let's dig a little deeper. This is what defines the position of what's called nihilism. And what nihilism basically means is, nihilism pointed to nothingness, is that every system of what's good or bad or right and wrong that we could point to in the world, whatever it is, all of them are false, meaning none of them are true. So that means anything that anyone says or anything that any culture says about good, bad, right, and wrong is equally arbitrary. It doesn't matter if you're talking about the Aztec culture that used to sacrifice children and create walls with their skulls as part of their religious exercise, or a culture that is very interested in child welfare and spends a great deal of time educating parents on how to raise their children. So those are 2 different value systems. One sacrifices children, one sort of puts them at the center of moral life. And nihilism says they're different, but neither one of them is right, because none of them can be right, because they're all equally arbitrary. Now, people may believe that they have moral values. I may say, well, I am very dedicated to this candidate, or very dedicated to this cause, or very dedicated to this idea. I can say it, but it's an illusion. I'm deluding myself. So anybody who says that they believe in something as a moral value, and that it's actually a true moral value, they're they're engaged in magical thinking. They're engaged in child's play. They're engaged in a fantasy fairy tale land. So it doesn't matter if you think you believe it. It's not actually true if there's no true morality. So as I noted before, the word should and ought. So you should do this. You should stop drinking so much. Or you shouldn't hit your spouse. All that means is I would prefer you not to do that because I don't like it. It creates a negative sensation inside of me. That's all should means or should not means, is I like or dislike. So the example I like to use here is when I eat pizza, I love to douse it in hot sauce and then put a lot of Parmesan cheese on top of it. That's my preference. That's how I eat pizza. Right? And other people would say, you're ruining the pizza. Right? Well, all morality is like that. It's like, well, let me eat my pizza, you eat your pizza. You know, let me abuse my spouse and you don't do it. But it's like mind your own business. All of us mind our own business because each one of our conceptions of morality is equally nothing, dust. So if that's true, the only way to implement a point of view, the only way a moral view sort of settles on a culture or a people is through raw power. Not because it's true or it's right or people have come to a consensus on it, but because someone has somehow imposed it. Or if they can identify some kind of self-interest that they're all going to get along as long as they're getting this particular thing that they all want. But it's neither good nor bad. Now this view of morality, as should be evident, right, it violates both the conditions of command and motivation, meaning there's nothing that commands you what to do or what not to do in this system of morality because there's no system of morality, and therefore you have no motivation. There's no reason for you to do or not do anything at all. So let me just pause before we move to the next slide and just really emphasize here that anybody who's saying that there's no such thing as morality is committed to these implications. And in all the different ways that we've talked about, in all the different contexts we find ourselves encountering these ideas, which are radical ideas. I mean, they're like earth-shaking ideas that are given with just sort of the most nonchalant kind of, yeah, I don't believe in morality. You want to go get a sandwich? You know, just exit our lips as if they're nothing, right, are actually leading and necessarily have to lead to these conclusions. So we have to hold each other to account for the ideas that we profess. So option number one obviously isn't going to work. How about option number two? Now option number two is that morality exists and can be deduced from reason independent of either nature or independent of God. So we don't need nature here and we don't need God. This is a word I'm sure you've heard because it's in many ways it's a dominant form of thinking nowadays. This is the morality of what's called autonomy. Now autonomy, if you bring it down into its actual Greek construction, it's made up of the words auto and nomos. Nomos means law, and auto means, as you can probably guess, self. So literally it means that you are a law unto yourself. You create your own laws. Now this isn't relativistic. This is not relativistic. It's saying that the law comes from your own mind. It doesn't come from outside of you. It comes from your own mind. So you create your own laws, but those laws are structured by the very structure of your mind. Now, for those of you who want to go a bit deeper into the intellectual history of this, this is really the invention or discovery, depending on how you see it, of a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, an Enlightenment philosopher, one of the most influential philosophers ever. And I can't overemphasize how important this idea has become into our contemporary understandings of morality. So the basic idea here, what Immanuel Kant came to understand is that from his examination of the nature of God and the nature of existence, he never said that God doesn't exist. What he ultimately said is we can't know with any certainty whatsoever that God exists, and we can't know anything about the true nature of reality at a metaphysical level. These are things that we cannot know. So that therefore means that we cannot use God and we cannot use nature in order to talk about morality. We're only going to be left from the state of our rational minds itself. We're going to have to get everything from here and nothing from out there. And so one example that he uses is he says, well, in order to identify a moral principle, what we can do is we can do the test of universalizing something. And if we universalize it, that means if we take a principle that I have and then apply it to everybody else, we'll see if it's moral or not, whether or not it creates a contradiction. So the example he uses, and this is, his thought's immensely complex, so this is the most conspicuous example. This is the easiest one to use. You say, well, let's say I had a moral principle, and my moral principle was that every time I tell a promise, I'm going to intend to break it. That's the principle I'm going to use with regards to promise keeping. So that's my orienting idea. So every time that I promise something, I'm going to do so with the intention of later breaking that promise. So what Immanuel Kant would say is, okay, is that a good principle or a bad principle? Is it right or wrong? Universalize it. Well, what would it be like if every single person acted according to the same principle that you're acting towards? Now, we have to be careful here because he's not saying that there would be bad consequences. There would be bad consequences, but he's not using consequences in order to derive his moral theory. What he's saying is that what would happen to the very idea of promise if every single person acted according to what he calls the maxim that every time I make a promise, I'm going to break it? The whole idea of promise, what? Poof, it disappears. In other words, you contradict yourself when you universalize that principle. That, he thinks, is something that we can deduce from the mind itself. For what it's worth, Immanuel Kant he's a genius. He's a very, very smart man. And using this process of just looking at the necessary structure of the mind, he thinks that we can ultimately get to what he calls the categorical imperative. And all that means is that every time we act, he says, in order to be rational, in order to recognize how our mind functions, we have to treat every single person with whom we are acting as if they are also capable of doing the same thing that we're capable of doing in terms of identifying universal laws. The language he puts it in is you treat everybody as an end and not only as a means, meaning that you never treat somebody only as a resource to get what you want. You always recognize in them the same capacity that you have. So this creates what are called moral boundaries among all individuals. And so the framework, the moral framework that emerges here has nothing to do with good and bad. It's a nuanced point, but it's so important. Good and bad has to do with concepts of morality from nature. And remember, he said nature can't teach us anything. Rather, the language is what? Right and wrong. Now, what does that mean?